Hello there, little ones. Gather around and get comfortable, because tonight, I am going to tell you a story unlike any you have ever heard before. It is a story of adventure, of deep secrets, and of a journey that begins where you least expect it. So, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let's begin. The library was a place where shadows seemed to have a life of their own, dancing between the endless rows of dusty, leather-bound books that reached up toward a ceiling lost in darkness. Sammy, Lena, Sarah, and Yusuf walked in absolute silence, their footsteps barely audible against the creaking, warped floorboards that had not seen a visitor in decades. The air was thick, suffocating, and heavy with the scent of ancient, decaying parchment, dried ink, and something else, a faint, sharp, metallic tang that made the hair on their arms stand up and their skin prickle with an instinctual, primal warning. They had been told countless times by the teachers never to enter this restricted section, but the pull of the unknown was a burning fire in their chests that they simply could not extinguish. As they moved deeper into the labyrinth of towering shelves, the dim, yellow light from the hallway faded away, leaving them in a soft, eerie twilight where even their own breathing sounded loud and intrusive. The silence of the room was heavy, almost physical, broken only by the rhythmic, slow ticking of a massive, rusted grandfather clock in the corner that sounded less like a timepiece and more like a slow, deliberate countdown to something inevitable. Sammy stopped suddenly, his hand brushing against a spine that felt unnaturally cold, a sharp contrast to the stagnant warmth of the room. It was hidden behind a stack of rotting manuscripts and thick cobwebs, almost as if the library itself had been trying to stay concealed from the world for centuries, protecting a secret it was never meant to share. He reached out and pulled the heavy tome from its resting place, and the sheer weight of it surprised him. It felt as if it were carved from a single block of heavy, dark iron, cold enough to sting his palms. The cover bore no title or author, only a singular, intricate symbol that shimmered with a faint, pulsing golden hue, beating like the heart of a dying star. Lena leaned in, her voice a mere tremble in the vast, tomb-like room. She whispered to him, her eyes wide with fear, asking if they should really be opening something that felt so heavy with history and darkness, but Sammy's fingers were already moving with a mind of their own. He fumbled with the clasp, his hands shaking, until he finally undid the latch. The moment the first page turned, the sound was like a thunderclap, a violent, resonant crack that echoed through the empty library until it felt like the very stone walls were vibrating. A strange, swirling mist began to rise from the pages, glowing with colors that didn't belong to the world they knew: vibrant, burning crimsons, deep, abyssal purples, and electric, neon blues that seemed to sear their retinas. The four friends stood paralyzed, caught in the grip of a force they could not understand, as the mist grew thicker, wrapping around their ankles and rising toward their faces like a living thing. Before they could even scream for help, the entire room twisted violently. The floor beneath their feet dissolved into nothingness, and they were suddenly pulled into a chaotic, screaming vortex of light and sound that felt like being dragged through the very fabric of the universe. Their vision blurred, the familiar shelves and dusty aisles shattered into a million shimmering shards, and the sensation of gravity vanished completely, leaving them weightless, terrified, and utterly alone in a sea of impossible, blinding light. When the spinning finally stopped, the silence that followed was total, yet it was a different kind of silence, a heavy, humid silence that pressed painfully against their eardrums. They weren't in the library anymore. The floor was now soft, damp, mossy earth, and the air was hot, thick, and sticky, vibrating with the distant, guttural calls of creatures that had been extinct for millions of years. Sammy stood up slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, and looked down at the book still clutched in his hands. It was still open, but the pages were no longer made of paper, they were shifting, forming an intricate, glowing map that pulsed with an amber light, showing them a world of giant, prehistoric ferns and towering, strange-leaved trees that seemed to stretch up toward a bruised, alien-looking orange sky. Sarah clutched Sammy's arm, her fingers digging into his skin as she pointed toward the horizon. Huge, jagged, terrifying shadows moved between the massive trees, and the ground beneath them shook with a rhythmic, heavy thud that sounded like a giant, unstoppable heartbeat. They realized with a sinking, icy feeling in their stomachs that they weren't just visitors in this place, they were intruders in a land ruled by beasts that had never known the touch of a human hand. As they tried to move, a low, guttural growl vibrated through the dense jungle air, so loud and deep that it made their very teeth ache. They scrambled toward a cluster of giant, gnarled roots, hiding just as a massive, scaled predator emerged from the thick brush. It moved with a terrifying, liquid grace, its scales shimmering like polished obsidian, and its cold, vertical slit eyes scanning the area with a hunger that was purely, brutally ancient. Sammy clutched the book to his chest, realizing with a start that the light on the pages was the only thing guiding them, the only thing that hadn't abandoned them. They had to reach a nearby cave system marked on the glowing map, but as they sprinted through the dense, tangled undergrowth, the jungle seemed to close in around them, determined to keep them lost in its dark, prehistoric depths forever. Every step was a desperate battle against the razor-sharp thorns, every breath was a struggle against the suffocating, humid heat, and behind them, the relentless, crashing pursuit of the hunter grew louder and more frantic with every passing second. They were no longer children playing in a library, they were prey in a world that had forgotten the meaning of mercy, and the path ahead promised only more darkness and more danger. The heavy humidity of the prehistoric jungle clung to their skin, a stark, suffocating contrast to the crisp, dust-filled air of the library they had left behind. Every breath felt thick with the scent of damp moss, crushed ferns, and an underlying, sharp musk, the scent of something primal and very, very alive. Sammy, Lena, Sarah, and Yusuf huddled together behind the colossal, gnarled roots of a conifer tree that stood like a silent guardian of the forest. The golden book in Sammy's hands was no longer just a collection of pages, it felt alive, vibrating with a rhythmic, low-frequency hum that pulsed in perfect sync with the frantic, terrified beating of their own hearts. "We have to move," Sammy whispered, his voice barely audible over the distant, alien trilling of birds hidden high within the canopy. "The map is shifting again. It's leading us toward a network of limestone caves, but the path isn't a straight line. It's a winding, treacherous maze through the heart of this territory." Lena stared up at the sky, her eyes wide and glassy with unshed tears. The sun, a bruised and unnatural shade of orange, seemed to hang low and heavy in the air, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like specters between the massive trunks of the trees. "Sammy, look at the ground," she urged, her voice trembling. She pointed toward the mud where giant, circular depressions were pressed deep into the earth, spaced widely apart, each one large enough to swallow a bicycle whole. "Whatever made these tracks isn't just big, it's heavy, and it's fast. We aren't just in a jungle, we are walking through the middle of a migration path." Yusuf, who had been nervously scanning the dense undergrowth, suddenly froze. He grabbed Sarah's arm, his grip so tight it left white marks on her skin. "Do you hear that?" The jungle, which had been alive with the chaotic symphony of buzzing insects and the distant, melodic cries of strange, unseen creatures, suddenly went deathly silent. It was a silence so absolute, so heavy, that it felt like the forest itself was holding its breath in anticipation of a predator. Then, it started a low-frequency vibration that they didn't just hear with their ears, they felt it rattling deep inside their chests, a rhythmic thumping that seemed to grow in intensity with every passing second. Thump! 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 Sarah's voice was a barely audible tremor. "It's getting louder. Whatever is coming, it's not just big. It's hunting." A massive, sweeping shadow detached itself from the high canopy, eclipsing the orange sun and plunging their small refuge into an unnatural, shivering darkness. They pressed their backs against the roots, their breath hitching in their throats. Peering through the narrow gaps in the foliage, their eyes widened in absolute horror. Emerging from the brush was a creature of terrifying, apex beauty, an entity with scales that shimmered like polished obsidian under the dim light, and eyes that held the cold, calculating intelligence of a hunter that had ruled this world for millions of years. It didn't roar in a way that sounded like a simple animal, it issued a long, guttural hiss that cut through the humid air like a jagged, serrated blade, freezing the blood in their veins. "We need to move, now," Sammy whispered, his mind racing to process the impossible situation. "If we stay here, it will catch our scent, and there won't be anywhere to hide." "But where?" Lena asked, her voice cracking. "There is nothing but forest in every direction." Sammy looked down at the book. The amber light was flickering violently, forming a faint, glowing path on the map that led deeper into the dark, tangled heart of the jungle. "The book," he said, his voice gaining a sudden, desperate sliver of hope. "It's showing us a way. There's a cave system ahead, marked by a symbol I haven't seen before. If we can reach it before the beast circles back, we might have a chance to disappear into the earth." They bolted from their cover, their feet pounding against the mossy floor, their movements fueled by pure, unadulterated adrenaline. The jungle seemed to conspire against them, with thick, snaking vines reaching out like tripwires and dense, low-hanging branches clawing at their clothes as if trying to hold them in place. Behind them, the predator let out a piercing, bone-chilling shriek that shattered the silence of the forest, followed by the terrifying, rhythmic crashing of heavy trees as it began its relentless pursuit. They ran until their lungs burned like fire and their legs felt like leaden weights. Just as the massive, towering shadow of the hunter loomed directly over them, Yusuf spotted it, a dark, jagged and unassuming opening in the side of a sheer limestone cliff, partially hidden by thick, cascading curtains of hanging vines. "There! In the cliffside!" Yusuf screamed, gesturing wildly. They threw themselves into the darkness of the cave just as a massive, clawed foot slammed into the ground where they had been standing only a heartbeat before. The predator smashed its armored head against the entrance, its hot, sulphurous breath filling the cavernous space, but the opening was far too narrow for it to follow. It let out a frustrated, earth-shaking roar that echoed deep into the tunnels, vibrating through the cold stone walls and dislodging loose rocks from the ceiling. Safe for the moment, they huddled together in the damp, freezing dark, gasping for air as their hearts slowly began to settle. But as the predator's heavy, deliberate footsteps finally faded into the distance, Sammy shone the glowing light of the book into the depths of the cave. His heart sank into his stomach. The path the book was showing didn't lead back toward the jungle, it spiraled deeper and deeper into the earth, into a labyrinth of tunnels that looked older, darker, and far more claustrophobic than the world they had just left behind. They had escaped the hunter, but they had walked directly into something else, something that felt like it had been waiting for them in the deep, silent, ancient dark. They were deep underground now, where the laws of the world they knew had no meaning, and the shadows here seemed to have eyes of their own. The descent into the labyrinth was not a simple walk, it was a transition into a world where the air grew thin, cold, and heavy with the scent of damp minerals and stagnant, ancient water. As they moved deeper into the cavern, the glowing amber light from the book became their only anchor to reality. The tunnels were not carved by nature alone, there were carvings on the walls, strange, rhythmic patterns that looked like constellations, pulsing faintly whenever Sammy brought the book close to the stone. "Do you see these marks?" Yusuf whispered, reaching out to touch a jagged engraving. "They aren't just scratches. They look like a language, a history written by someone, or something, that lived here long before the dinosaurs." Lena clutched her sweater, her knuckles white. "It feels like the walls are closing in on us. How much deeper do we have to go?" "Sammy, the map, what does it say?" Sammy stopped, holding the book steady. The amber light was no longer just a path, it was expanding, painting the walls in a soft, ethereal glow. "It says we aren't at the end of the journey," he replied, his voice echoing strangely in the vast space. "The map is leading us toward something called the echo chamber. It claims that time works differently here, that the deeper we go, the more the past and the future start to bleed together." Suddenly, the ground beneath them shifted. It wasn't an earthquake, but rather the sensation of the very foundation of the cave moving, like the internal gears of a colossal, sleeping machine. The tunnel ahead opened up into a cavern of impossible scale, a space so vast that the ceiling was lost in a thick, swirling mist of silver and violet. In the center of the chamber stood a series of floating obsidian monoliths, circling a pool of water that was perfectly still, reflecting a sky that shouldn't have existed underground. "Look at the water," Sarah gasped, stepping toward the edge of the pool. Instead of their own faces, the surface of the water showed scenes from their own lives: Sammy sitting at his desk at school, Lena playing in her garden, Yusuf laughing with his family, but the scenes were twisted, aged, or changed. They were watching versions of themselves that had grown old, or versions that had never left their homes at all. "This place," Sammy started, but his words were cut off by a sound that wasn't a roar, but a melody. It was a high, crystalline chime that hummed through the air, vibrating in their very bones. From behind the obsidian monoliths, shapes began to coalesce. They were translucent, shimmering like moonlight on water, and they moved with a fluidity that defied gravity. They weren't dinosaurs, and they certainly weren't human. They were the guardians of the echo, beings made of memory and light. They didn't speak with mouths, but a voice resonated directly inside their minds, a collective, ancient whisper that sounded like the turning of a million pages at once. "Why do you bring the chronicle into our sanctuary, travelers?" Sammy felt his knees weaken, but he held the book up, its golden tassel glowing with intense, blinding light. "We didn't mean to come here," he shouted, his voice gaining strength. "We were looking for a way home, a way back to the library. We aren't here to steal your history, we are just lost." The beings drifted closer, their forms shifting to mirror the shapes of the four friends. It was unnerving, seeing reflections of themselves that looked as if they were made of starlight. "The chronicle is not a key for the lost," the voice echoed in their heads. "It is a mirror. It shows you exactly what you need to see, not what you want to see. To leave this chamber, you must pass the trial of the reflection. You must choose which part of your own truth you are willing to let go of to move forward." "What does that mean?" Yusuf asked, panic rising in his chest. "We can't just let go of things. We don't have time for riddles." The central monolith began to glow a deep, angry crimson. The water in the pool started to bubble, and the reflections of their lives began to flicker and burn away. The chamber was changing. The peaceful, silver mist was turning into a dark, swirling storm. The guardians stood perfectly still, waiting for an answer. Sammy realized then that the book in his hands had been pulsing in time with the monoliths, and the path forward was closing. If they didn't make a choice, they would be trapped in this echo of time forever, becoming nothing more than memories flickering in the dark, forgotten by the world above. "We have to choose," Sammy said, his voice hard with resolve. "The book is waiting. Whatever we choose, we have to do it together. If we go through this, we aren't going to be the same people when we come out on the other side." The air grew heavy with the weight of their decisions. They stood on the precipice of the pool, the swirling storm above them growing louder, waiting for them to cast away a piece of who they were to earn their freedom. Each of them knew what they would have to leave behind, and for the first time since they left the library, the terrifying reality of their journey sank in. The book wasn't just taking them to different worlds, it was changing them, piece by piece, as they traveled through the heart of the unknown. The decision hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. As the monolithic pillars continued to pulse with that rhythmic, maddening crimson light, the four friends stood on the edge of the reflective pool. The water was no longer just showing their past, it was beginning to pull at their very consciousness. Sammy felt a strange, cold sensation in his mind, as if someone or something was sifting through his memories, picking out the moments he feared the most. The trial was not a physical fight, it was a battle against the things they were most afraid of losing. "I can't do it," Lena whispered, her voice cracking as she watched her own reflection in the pool begin to dissolve. "If I give up that memory of my grandmother, I'll lose the last thing that makes me feel like I'm really me. I'll be empty." "It's not about losing who you are," Sammy said, his voice firm even though his own hands were shaking. He gripped the golden book tighter, and for a fleeting second, the tome seemed to whisper back to him, a soft, hummed sound that bypassed his ears and resonated directly in his thoughts. The book isn't asking us to forget, it's asking us to move past the weight of what we've been clinging to. We are stuck because we are looking backward. We have to look at the path ahead. As if triggered by his words, the central monolith shot a beam of pure, white light into the swirling mist above. The chamber roared, a sound like 1,000 crashing waves, and the walls began to vibrate so violently that dust rained down from the ceiling. The guardians of the echo drifted forward, their translucent forms now towering over them, shimmering with an intense, blinding radiance. The path of the past is a comfort, but it is a cage, the collective voice boomed inside their minds, vibrating with the power of an earthquake. To walk into the lands of the sky, you must leave the anchor of your fears. Choose. Now. Sarah, who had been the quietest, suddenly stepped forward. She looked at her reflection, the version of herself that was always afraid, always hiding in the background, always waiting for someone else to lead the way. "I'm tired of being afraid," she said, her voice small but steady. She knelt by the pool and placed her palm against the water. The surface rippled, and the dark, swirling image of her fear vanished, replaced by a calm, crystalline light. She let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for a lifetime, and her whole demeanor changed. She stood taller, her eyes bright with a sudden, sharp clarity. One by one, they followed. Yusuf let go of his need for control, his desire to always have a plan, and as he did, the heavy, anxious tension that had defined his every movement seemed to melt away. Lena embraced the memory of her past, choosing to keep the love but release the paralyzing grief that had kept her from moving forward. Finally, it was Sammy's turn. Sammy looked at the book, the source of all their trouble and all their wonder. He realized that he had been holding onto it as if it were a life raft, as if he were nothing without it. He looked at his reflection and saw a boy who was desperate to be a hero, who was terrified that he would fail his friends. He closed his eyes, let go of the need to be the leader, and simply accepted that he was just a boy on a journey. He touched the water. A shockwave of white light exploded from the pool, throwing them backward. The chamber went silent. The monolith stopped pulsing, the mist vanished, and the pool became still, clear, and perfectly empty. The guardians were gone, leaving behind a profound, expectant void. Where the obsidian pillars had stood, a massive, circular archway had emerged from the stone, carved with symbols of clouds and wings. "We did it," Yusuf said, his voice sounding different, calmer, more grounded. They stood up, dusting themselves off, but as they looked at the archway, they realized the chamber was beginning to fade. The walls were becoming transparent, revealing a view that defied all logic. Beyond the archway wasn't another tunnel or a cave, it was an endless expanse of swirling, golden white clouds, stretching out in every direction. They weren't underground anymore, they were standing on a ledge that overlooked a kingdom made entirely of wind and vapor. The echo chamber was just the gateway, Sammy realized, stepping toward the archway. The golden book in his hands felt different now, lighter, as if the heavy iron was fading into something more ephemeral. "We've left the world of the stone and the earth behind. The map is showing us a new path, but look at the horizon." They stepped through the archway, their feet finding solid ground on a path made of solidified light that hovered in the open sky. Before them lay the city of clouds, a sprawling metropolis of spires and floating platforms that moved gently with the breeze. It was a kingdom that seemed to be held up by the sky itself, a place where gravity was a suggestion rather than a rule. But even from this distance, they could see that all was not well. The spires were leaning, and the golden white clouds were being stained by a creeping, dark purple fog that rolled in from the edges of the horizon. They had escaped the prehistoric depths, but they had arrived in a world that was dying. As the wind whipped around them, pulling at their hair and clothes, Sammy looked at the book. The map had changed again, it was no longer pulsing with amber light, but with a flickering, panicked violet. They had arrived in the city of clouds, but they had walked straight into the middle of an aerial war that had been raging for an eternity, and the peace they had earned in the echo chamber was about to be tested in ways they could never have imagined. The city of clouds was not built of stone or steel, but of something that felt like hardened sunlight and crystallized vapor. As the four friends stepped onto the main platform, a sprawling, circular plaza that hummed with a low, musical vibration, they realized that gravity here was indeed a suggestion. They felt light, almost weightless, their steps causing them to drift slightly above the ground. Below them, the sky stretched on in an infinite tapestry of blue and gold, but their attention was fixed on the encroaching purple fog. It moved like a living oil spill, devouring the radiant light of the city and leaving behind a cold, silent void. "We need to move," Yusuf said, his voice carrying clearly in the thin, crisp air. He pointed toward the central spire, a magnificent, spiraling tower that seemed to act as the city's heart. "If that fog is what's killing this place, the source has to be near the center. That spire looks like it's holding the entire city together." As they began to traverse the narrow, arched bridges that connected the platforms, they saw the inhabitants of the city, beings of wind and light, thin and ethereal, who moved with a sad, sluggish grace. They weren't fighting the fog, they were surrendering to it, fading away as the dark mist touched their translucent forms. One of the city dwellers, an elder with robes that shimmered like a sunset, drifted toward them, his expression one of profound, ancient sorrow. "You are the travelers of the Chronicle," the elder whispered, the sound like the rustling of autumn leaves. "You have come through the echo chamber, but you arrive at the twilight of our world. The shadow mist has been eating our spires for cycles, and we have no strength left to hold it back." Sammy clutched the golden book, which was now vibrating with a frantic, cold energy. "What is the shadow mist? Where did it come from?" "It is the absence of memory," the elder replied, fading slightly as a wisp of the purple fog drifted nearby. "Our city is built upon the stories of the stars. When a story is forgotten, when a memory is lost to time, it turns into this hunger. The deeper you go into the city's heart, the closer you get to the well of erasure. That is where all forgotten things go to die, and it is from there that the mist rises to claim what remains." They pushed forward, the bridges becoming increasingly unstable as the city began to crumble into the sky. The wind grew violent, howling with the voices of thousands of lost stories, trying to distract them, trying to make them lose their footing and fall into the endless blue beneath. Sarah, her newfound clarity serving as their compass, led the way. She could see the faint, golden threads of the city's structure that were still intact, weaving through the chaos. They reached the base of the central spire, but the entrance was blocked by a barrier of solid, roiling purple fog. It wasn't just gas, it felt like a wall of sheer, icy despair. Sammy felt the book pulse in his hands, and he realized with a jolt of panic that the book wasn't just a map anymore, it was a beacon. The mist was attracted to the very energy that had brought them here. "It wants the book," Sammy realized, his voice trembling. "It's not just eating the city, it's looking for a way to rewrite the history that we're carrying." "Then we don't use it as a map," Lena suggested, her eyes narrowing as she looked at the barrier. "We use it as a shield. If the book holds the memories of all the places we've been, maybe those memories can push back the void." They stood together, forming a circle around the book. Sammy opened the pages wide, and instead of a map, they saw flashes of everything they had experienced: the damp, dark library, the prehistoric jungle, the cold, echoing silence of the echo chamber. They focused on those memories, pulling the warmth of their experiences into the center. The book began to glow, not with the dim, flickering amber of before, but with a brilliant, roaring fire of pure, human recollection. They stepped into the barrier of purple fog. It felt like walking through a blizzard of forgotten names and abandoned dreams. Their minds were bombarded with whispers of things that had never happened, of faces they didn't know, and of futures that were being erased before they could occur. Sammy's knees buckled under the psychic weight, but he kept his grip on the book, roaring as he pushed the memories of his friends, the laughter in the library, the terror in the jungle, the relief in the cavern into the pages. With a sound like a great glass bell shattering, the barrier exploded. The purple fog was blasted backward, dissipating into nothingness as the sheer force of their combined reality tore through the manufactured void. They stumbled into the inner sanctum of the spire, gasping for air. Before them sat the well of erasure, a basin of swirling, empty darkness that seemed to pull the light out of the air. But as they looked into it, they saw something that made their hearts stop. Floating in the center of the darkness were items from their own world, a school notebook, a forgotten toy, a broken pen. The well wasn't just eating the stories of this city, it was collecting the discarded memories of their own world. It was a bridge between dimensions, and it was starving. The spire groaned, tilting dangerously as the ground beneath them began to disintegrate. They had reached the heart of the crisis, but they were standing on a platform that was rapidly dissolving into the sky, and the darkness in the well was starting to reach out, forming hands made of nothingness, desperate to drag them in to fill its empty, aching void. The platform beneath them groaned, a sound of strained glass and snapping starlight, as the well of erasure surged upward. Those hands of nothingness, woven from the void, stretched out like grasping shadows, hungrier and more defined than before. They weren't just shadows, they were the physical manifestation of silence, the emptiness that follows when someone is forgotten. It's not just a well, Sarah shouted, her voice cutting through the roar of the crumbling spire. It's a funnel. It's feeding on the stories we bring with us. Sammy looked at the book, but the pages were blurred, the ink swirling as if the stories themselves were trying to escape into the abyss. The well was a bottomless hole in reality, and the closer they stood, the more their own memories began to fray at the edges. Sammy felt his grip on his own childhood, the smell of his home, the sound of his mother's voice flickering like a dying light bulb. We have to plug it. Yusuf screamed, grabbing a heavy, crystallized shard of the spire that had broken off in the tremors. If we can't destroy the void, we have to seal it. With what? Lena cried, ducking as a tendril of darkness lashed out, turning a portion of the floor into transparent vapor. Everything we touch just turns into mist. Sammy looked at the golden book, then at his friends. He understood now. The book wasn't meant to be a permanent container for these worlds, it was a bridge, and it had become overladen with the weight of their journey. If they wanted to close the well, they had to give the book a memory so powerful, so anchored in truth, that the void couldn't possibly consume it. They needed a memory of now the reality of their friendship, forged in the fires of these strange new worlds. Join hands! Sammy commanded, his voice echoing with an authority that surprised even him. They locked hands in a tight circle, their knuckles white, their feet braced against the tilting floor. Sammy placed the book in the center of their joined palms. Don't think about the library. Don't think about the past. Think about us. Right now, in this moment, in this city. Think about the fact that we are still here, together. The void surged, a tidal wave of purple and black, ready to swallow them whole. As the darkness washed over them, they didn't push it back with force, they pushed it back with presence. They focused on the warmth of each other's skin, the frantic rhythm of their shared breathing, and the absolute, undeniable truth of their bond. The reaction was instantaneous. The book didn't just glow, it detonated with a supernova of pure, golden light. It was the light of 1,000 suns, warm, solid, and incredibly heavy. It hit the well of erasure with a force that felt like a physical hammer. The dark, grasping hands shattered like thin ice, and the swirling darkness of the well groaned a sound of profound, defeated emptiness. The spire stopped shaking. The purple fog, denied its food, turned grey and then white, dissolving into harmless steam that drifted away into the blue sky. The well of erasure collapsed inward, shrinking until it was nothing more than a small, glowing seed of light at the center of the basin. Silence returned to the city of clouds, but it was a heavy, exhausted silence. The platform was still tilted, and parts of the spire had vanished into the abyss below, leaving them standing on a narrow, precarious island of crystallized light. Sammy picked up the book. It was cold, not the cold of iron, but the cold of a deep, winter night. The golden tassel had frayed, and the symbol on the cover had dimmed to a faint, ghostly outline. "We closed it," Yusuf whispered, collapsing onto the floor and gasping for air. "We actually closed it. But at what cost?" Lena asked, her voice hushed. She pointed to the horizon. The Golden Kingdom was still dying. Though the fog was gone, the structures were too damaged to hold their shape. The city was drifting apart, the platforms slowly detaching and floating off into the endless expanse of the sky. The elder they had met earlier drifted toward them, his form now solid and vibrant. He looked at the book in Sammy's hands with a mixture of reverence and sadness. "You have saved the essence of our city from the erasure," the elder said, his voice now melodic and clear. "But you have also broken the connection that kept us tethered to your world. We are no longer a reflection of your stories, we are adrift. Can we fix it?" Sarah asked, stepping forward. "The book is exhausted," the elder replied, touching the cover lightly. "To move on, you must leave the sky behind. There is a breach ahead, a tear in the fabric of the heavens. It will take you to the next threshold. But be warned, the next world does not deal in memories or light. It deals in the crushing weight of the deep, and it will require a different kind of strength than you have ever known." As the elder finished speaking, the platform they stood on gave a violent lurch. The city began to disintegrate, the very air around them starting to ripple like water. A giant, swirling portal of deep, oceanic blue opened up in the sky, shimmering with the pressure of 1,000 atmospheres. It was a passage into the deep, dark, and uncharted waters that existed at the very foundation of the multiverse. They had saved the city of clouds, but they had no time to mourn its passing. The sky was falling, and the next gate was pulling them toward the crushing, silent depths of an ocean that had never seen the light of day. The transition into the seventh world was not a fall, it was a drowning that felt like a baptism. As they plunged through the oceanic portal, the golden white light of the city of clouds was instantly replaced by an oppressive, crushing weight of dark, liquid sapphire. They weren't just falling, they were being pulled into the deepest, most inaccessible trench of an infinite, lightless sea. Their lungs burned, and for a terrifying moment, Sammy thought they would suffocate. But then, the golden book, now a dull, heavy stone in his grip, began to emit a soft, bioluminescent pulse. A shimmering bubble of pressurized, breathable air formed around them, expanding just enough to protect their bodies from the immense pressure of the deep. They floated together in this translucent sphere, suspended in the silent, terrifying heart of a vast underwater cosmos. "Look," Yusuf whispered, his voice sounding hollow and metallic inside the sphere. Beyond the thin membrane of their bubble, the ocean was not empty. It was a forest of colossal, glowing coral reefs that spiraled toward the surface like twisted, alien cathedrals. Schools of fish with scales made of liquid silver darted through the currents, and gargantuan, whale-like creatures drifted past, their bodies covered in bioluminescent patterns that shifted like constellations. It was a world of absolute, profound quiet, where the only sound was the muffled, rhythmic thud of their own hearts against the crushing stillness. "The map," Sarah said, her voice trembling as she looked at the book. "It's not showing us a path anymore. It's showing us a hunger." The book's pages had transformed. Instead of maps or symbols, the parchment now displayed a swirling, chaotic vortex of currents. A deep, resonant vibration began to rattle their sphere, a sound so low it felt like the ocean itself was groaning. Out from the shadows of the massive coral cathedrals, something rose. It wasn't a monster of scales or teeth, but a shifting, semi-solid entity made of water and pressurized dark energy. It was the Warden of the Tides, a creature that seemed to be the embodiment of the pressure they were currently feeling. "You have brought the weight of the sky into the sanctuary of the deep," the entity's voice resonated, not in their ears, but through the water against their bones. It was a cold, indifferent voice, devoid of the mercy they had found in the city of clouds. "The surface world is a place of flight and fragility. Here, only the dense, the heavy, and the unyielding survive. Why should I allow you to pass through my waters with such light, airy souls? Sammy held the book up, its glow dimming under the intense pressure of the warden's gaze. We aren't here to stay. We are traveling between the gates. We've saved worlds, and we've paid the price of our own memories to do it. We have the strength to be here. The warden drifted closer, its form swirling like a whirlpool. Strength is not proven by what you have saved, traveler. It is proven by what you can endure when you have absolutely nothing left to hold onto. The deeper you go, the more the water will strip away your identities, your fears, and your hopes. You will become nothing but bone and instinct. Are you prepared to lose everything that makes you human? We already lost parts of ourselves in the clouds. Lena shouted, her eyes bright with a dangerous, newfound intensity. If this world wants to crush us, let it try. We have survived the prehistoric terror and the collapse of the skies. We won't break here. The warden's form suddenly intensified, the water around their sphere beginning to swirl with violent, white-hot ferocity. The sphere started to shrink, the pressure beginning to crack the protective barrier. The water outside the bubble grew dark, then black, as the bioluminescence of the reef was extinguished by the warden's overwhelming power. It's not just talking, Yusuf gasped, clutching his chest as the shrinking bubble began to compress his movements. It's testing us. It's testing our capacity to resist the weight of this world. They were forced into a tight huddle as the bubble shrank to the size of a small room. The crushing force of the abyss bore down on them, a physical weight that made it hard to even think, let alone speak. This was the trial of the deep, the struggle to maintain one's sense of self when the entire weight of an infinite, uncaring ocean is pressing down on your soul. Sammy looked at the book. The pages were wet, the ink running, the stories they had lived beginning to bleed into a singular, dark smudge. He realized that the warden wasn't just trying to destroy them, it was trying to dissolve them into the currents, to turn them into just another drop in this eternal, silent sea. Focus! Sammy roared, his voice straining against the narrowing walls of the bubble. Think about the library. Not the place, but the feeling of it. The smell of the paper, the scratch of the wood, the feeling of being somewhere safe. Build a wall around your minds. Do not let the pressure in. They closed their eyes, gripping each other's hands with such force that it hurt. They forced themselves to remember the most mundane, human things, the way the light looked in the afternoon, the taste of simple water, the sound of a distant bell. They built a fortress of trivial, beautiful, human memories, and as they did, the sphere stopped shrinking. The warden watched them, its swirling, liquid eyes unblinking. To hold on to the mundane in the face of the infinite, the warden whispered, its voice softening, that is a rare kind of defiance. The pressure eased, and the sphere expanded back to its original size. The blackness began to recede, and the bioluminescent light of the coral cathedrals returned in a riot of color. The warden bowed, its form dispersing into the surrounding currents, leaving behind a shimmering, pearl-like key that drifted toward the bubble. The key to the eighth gate, Sarah said, reaching out to touch the sphere's membrane, which parted to let the pearl drift inside. They were still deep, still underwater, and still far from home. But as Sammy held the pearl key, he felt a strange, cold clarity. They had survived the crushing weight, but he could see in the distance, past the coral reefs, a faint, rhythmic pulsing of a much darker, much more sinister power. They had conquered the pressure, but they hadn't conquered the threat that was following them through the gates, a shadow that was learning from them, a force that was getting stronger with every world they crossed. They had to keep moving, but the path ahead was no longer just a mystery, it was becoming a hunt. The transition from the abyssal pressures of the deep to the eighth world was like stepping out of a suffocating vice into a world of crystalline, razor-sharp silence. As they exited the gate, the pearl key dissolving into a shimmering mist that pulled them forward, they didn't land on earth or water, but on a surface of polished, black obsidian that stretched infinitely in every direction. The sky above was not a sky at all, but a massive, rotating mechanism of interlocking bronze gears and glowing vacuum tubes, ticking with a mechanical precision that made their teeth ache. This was the clockwork expanse, a dimension where time was not a flow, but a ticking, grinding commodity. "We're exposed," Yusuf said, his voice unusually sharp in the thin, metallic air. He looked around. The landscape was dotted with towering, spinning spires of brass and copper, and the horizon was dominated by a colossal, golden pendulum that swung back and forth with a sound that shook the ground beneath their feet. Talk! 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 It was the heartbeat of this world, and it was fast, too fast. "The book," Sammy said, looking down. The golden tome was no longer a book, it had transformed into a complex, rotating puzzle box of interlocking plates. Its pages were now shifting metal tiles, displaying not stories, but a countdown. A series of glowing, crimson numbers was etching itself into the cover, 59 minutes and 59 seconds. "An hour," Lena whispered, her face pale. "It's counting down. If we don't find the next gate before it hits 0, what happens?" Before anyone could answer, the ground beneath them shivered. A squad of sentinels, tall, slender automatons with faces made of spinning clockwork faces, emerged from the obsidian floor. They moved with a jerky, unnatural rhythm, their limbs folding and unfolding like origami made of steel. They weren't hostile, but they were efficient, and they began to cordon off the area with barriers of humming, electrified light. "Correction required," the sentinels spoke in unison, their voices a cacophony of metallic clanking. "The sequence is disrupted. The travelers are an anomaly in the great mechanism. Efficiency must be restored. Proceed to the calibration chamber or be processed as waste material." "We don't have a choice," Sarah said, pointing toward a distant, glowing archway that seemed to be vibrating out of phase with the rest of the landscape. It was the gate, but it was guarded by a rotating series of gears that moved too quickly for any human to pass through. "We have to calibrate the time, or we'll never be fast enough to make it through that gate." They ran. Every step on the obsidian felt like running on glass, and the gears above them began to spin with terrifying velocity, making gravity shift and tilt. They were being pulled in different directions, as if the very laws of physics were being wound tighter and tighter. They dodged swinging pendulums that cut through the air with the sound of a guillotine and jumped over steam-venting grates that threatened to swallow them whole. The calibration chamber was a circular room filled with massive, floating clock faces. Each face displayed a different version of the journey they had already taken, a scene of them in the library, a memory of the jungle, a glimpse of the clouds. "It's a synchronization test," Sammy realized, his hands moving frantically over the surface of the book box. "It wants us to align our memories with the true time of the mechanism. If we get the timing wrong, the machine will erase our history to fix the timeline." The countdown dropped, 45 minutes. The sentinels arrived at the door, their movements growing faster, their clock face heads spinning in frantic circles. They began to dismantle the walls of the chamber, turning the room into a chaotic whirlwind of flying copper shards and grinding gears. "Yusuf, count the beats!" Sammy yelled, trying to match the shifting tiles of the book to the pendulum's rhythm. "It's not a standard beat," Yusuf shouted back, his eyes darting across the rotating room. "It's a polyrhythm. 3 against 4. We have to match the library memory to the slow beat and the jungle memory to the fast one." They worked with a desperate, frantic focus. They acted as a single unit, their bodies moving in sync with the ticking of the world. As they adjusted the memories in the book, the room began to stabilize. The grinding noise of the walls softened into a melodic, rhythmic harmony. The giant pendulum slowed, and the rotating gears began to align, creating a perfect, fluid bridge toward the exit. With 5 minutes left on the book's cover, the archway finally stopped vibrating. It stood still, a solid, golden ring of light. But as they raced toward it, Sammy felt a sudden, cold tug on his sleeve. He looked back and saw one of the sentinels reaching out, its metallic hand stopping inches from his face. It didn't attack. Instead, it projected a holographic image of the next world, a place of swirling fire and ash, a world of entropy where the gears had finally stopped and the mechanism had rusted into nothingness. The great mechanism is failing, the sentinel word, its voice low and oddly mournful. You think you are saving yourselves, but you are only accelerating the decay. The book is the key, but it is also the catalyst. The next gate leads to the end of all things. Do you truly wish to reach the center? Sammy hesitated, the book box heavy in his hands. He looked at his friends, weary, battered, and changed forever by the burdens they had carried. He looked at the gate, then back at the dying world of bronze and copper. We have to, Sammy said, his voice hardening. We didn't come this far to stop because we're afraid of the end. We come to see it through. They dove into the golden light of the gate just as the countdown hit 0, the entire clockwork expanse collapsing into a heap of silent, motionless scrap metal behind them. They were pushed out into a dimension of red, burning skies, where the air tasted of sulfur and the ground was made of cooling magma. They had reached the penultimate gate, and the weight of the journey was beginning to show. The book was cracked now, the metal tiles chipped and dull, and the road ahead was nothing but a graveyard of worlds, waiting for them to finally make their stand. The transition to the ninth world was not a movement, it was a collapse. As they stepped through the gate, the golden light did not deposit them onto firm ground, but rather threw them into a sky of churning, obsidian-colored ash. Below them, the landscape was a sprawling, silent graveyard of civilizations, mountains of rusted iron, valleys filled with the pulverized remains of forgotten art, and rivers of sluggish, cooling magma that pulsed like the veins of a dying titan. The heat was immense, a dry, suffocating furnace that threatened to turn their skin to parchment. They stood on a ridge of cooling volcanic rock, overlooking a vast, circular basin. In the center of the basin lay the entropy well, a massive, swirling vortex of heat and void that functioned like a reverse sun, pulling everything, the light, the heat, the very memory of color into its cold, grey heart. This is it, Yusuf said, his voice raspy and thin in the oxygen-starved air. The end of the line. The mechanism wasn't lying. This world is the collection point for all the worlds we've passed through. Sammy looked down at the book. It had stopped being a machine or a map. The metal tiles had fallen away, revealing a singular, pulsating core of pure, white light buried deep within the binding. It was the source of everything they had experienced, the anchor point of their entire journey. He could feel it humming against his palms, a sound of profound, lonely longing. It was tired, and for the first time, Sammy realized that the book was not a tool, it was a sentient artifact that had been trying to find its way home just as hard as they were. It wants to go back, Sammy whispered, his eyes fixed on the vortex. The entropy well is the only place left, and the book is trying to use it to collapse the barrier between us and the library. But if it does that, it might consume us in the process. As they descended into the basin, the air began to thicken with the ghosts of their past. They saw flickers of the dinosaurs, the translucent spirits of the Cloud City, the pressure-distorted forms of the abyss. The well was not just destroying things, it was attempting to reconstruct them, to force them into a final, chaotic unity. Stop! Sarah shouted, her voice ringing out like a bell as a tendril of dark energy reached for Lena. She planted her feet in the ash, her resolve turning into a physical shield. We are not raw material. We are the travelers. The entropy well roared in response, a sound that wasn't a noise, but a pressure that threatened to undo their very molecular structure. It was an intelligence of absolute, uncaring efficiency, seeking to balance the books of the universe by erasing the chaos of the journey. Suddenly, the ash around them began to form shapes, mirrors of themselves. 4 shadows stepped out of the swirling dust, perfect, dark reflections of Sammy, Lena, Sarah, and Yusuf. They didn't speak, they simply raised their hands, mirroring the movements of the friends. They're us, Lena realized, horror washing over her. They're the versions of us that were left behind in the other worlds. The versions that didn't make the jump. The shadows lunged. The battle that followed was not a fight of weapons, but a desperate struggle of identity. Every time Sammy parried a blow from his shadow, he felt a memory of the library slip away. Every time Yusuf pushed his reflection back, he felt his courage wavering, replaced by the crushing weight of the pressure they had endured in the deep. They were fighting their own histories, and the shadows were winning because they had nothing to lose. "We can't fight them with force," Sammy yelled, realizing that the shadows grew stronger with every strike. "They are the what-ifs. We have to accept them." He dropped his guard. The shadow Sammy, confused for a heartbeat, faltered. Sammy stepped forward and did the unthinkable, he embraced his reflection. The moment they touched, the shadow didn't vanish, it merged. A flood of cold, hard exhaustion rushed into Sammy's body, the feeling of every time he had almost quit, every moment of doubt he had ever hidden. He fell to his knees, his soul feeling heavy, but he didn't break. One by one, the others followed. Lena embraced the shadow of her grief, Yusuf embraced the shadow of his fear, Sarah embraced the shadow of her insignificance. As they merged with their darker counterparts, the swirling vortex of the entropy well slowed. The heat didn't dissipate, but it became manageable. They stood in the center of the basin, not as the bright, innocent children who had left the library, but as something far more complex, scarred, weary, and profoundly aware of the weight of their own existence. The well, seeing that they were no longer fragmented, began to stabilize. The obsidian ash settled, and a narrow, shimmering path emerged, leading directly into the heart of the vortex. "It's open," Sarah said, her voice deep and resonant. Sammy looked at the book one final time. It was no longer glowing, it was a simple, weathered journal, its pages filled with the faint, handwritten notes of their experiences. He tucked it under his arm. They had reached the penultimate gate, and they were ready for the final step. They turned their backs on the dying graveyard of worlds and stepped into the well, not as victims of the entropy, but as the masters of their own story, ready to face the 10th and final threshold. The final gate did not lead to a world, but to a doorway, a solitary, familiar wooden door standing unsupported in the middle of a vast, silent expanse of starlight. It was the heavy, iron-bound door of the restricted library, looking exactly as it had the night they left, yet it felt impossibly distant, as if centuries had passed since they had first pushed it open. Sammy approached the door, his heart not hammering this time, but beating with a steady, solemn rhythm. He looked back at his friends Lena, Sarah, and Yusuf. They were no longer the children who had wandered into the dark out of simple curiosity. They carried the weight of the prehistoric jungles, the cold of the abyss, the silence of the clouds, and the ash of the entropy graveyards in their eyes. They had been hollowed out and refilled with the experiences of 1,000 lifetimes. "We go through together," Sammy said, and this time, he didn't feel like a leader, but like an equal among brothers and sisters. He reached out and turned the iron handle. It didn't groan or scream, it clicked open with the soft, comforting sound of a lock being undone. As they stepped through, the cold, dark void of the starlight vanished, replaced by the warm, stagnant air of the restricted section. The smell of dust, parchment, and old ink rushed over them like a tide, so familiar it was painful. The library was exactly as they had left it. The grandfather clock was still ticking, its rhythmic tock-tock echoing in the vast, tomb-like room. The stacks of manuscripts were still covered in the same thick, grey cobwebs, and the dim, yellow light from the distant hallway still cast long, dancing shadows between the shelves. But as they looked at the room, they realized they were different. They weren't just returning to the place they had left, they were returning to the people they had been, and they knew now that those people no longer existed. Sammy looked down at the book. It was now just a simple, leather-bound diary, its pages filled with the faint, handwritten records of their journey. He walked to the shelf where he had first found it and placed it back into the gap between the rotting manuscripts. The moment it touched the shelf, the library seemed to exhale. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the room for centuries lifted, and for the first time, the library felt less like a tomb and more like a sanctuary. "We're home," Lena whispered, her voice breaking the heavy silence. "Are we?" Yusuf asked, looking at his own hands, which still felt as if they were stained with the ash of the ninth world. "I don't think I can ever just be a student again. I don't think any of us can." They walked out of the library, the heavy oak doors closing behind them with a final, definitive thud. When they stepped into the school hallway, the lights were bright, the air was clean, and the sounds of distant laughter and shouting from the playground drifted in through the windows. It was a normal day. Nobody had noticed they were gone. To the rest of the world, they had been away for only a few minutes. Sammy stopped at the end of the hall. He looked at his friends. Their faces were the same, yet the wisdom in their eyes was ancient. They shared a look that needed no words, a silent pact born from the crushing weight of the deep and the fire of the final threshold. "The book is back," Sammy said quietly. "The library is quiet. And we are still here." He turned and walked toward the exit, his footsteps sounding firm and steady on the linoleum. They hadn't just returned home, they had survived the destruction of everything they knew, and in doing so, they had discovered the one truth that the book had been trying to teach them from the very beginning: the story wasn't in the pages, and it wasn't in the worlds they had visited. The story was in the fact that they had walked through the fire, navigated the abyss, and come out the other side holding on to each other. They pushed open the main doors of the school and stepped out into the brilliant, blinding light of the afternoon sun. The world was loud, chaotic, and wonderfully, terrifyingly normal. They began to walk, not toward their homes, but toward the horizon, where the sky was blue and the wind was just the wind, finally free to write the next chapter of their lives, not as characters in a chronicle, but as the authors of their own destiny. The journey was over, the gate was closed, but the adventure, they realized with a quiet, knowing smile, had only just begun.